All right, welcome back to biology. This is Mr. Kubuske coming at you again. We're in the middle of our discussion of evolution. We're in the middle of Unit 9, if you're following along with us. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Indianapolis, so let's talk about the origins of life. This is the second part of our evolution unit. Don't worry about that thing down there about puffing. That is for something else. So today we're going to focus on first, how like life continues, where life goes, how it continues on, where it may have come from in the beginning, and we'll kind of pick it up from there. First thing we're going to talk about is biogenesis and spontaneous generation. Now, believe it or not, and you probably won't until you actually go back and look it up for yourself, but there was a long period of time in human history where we were smart enough to understand that we were living things, living beings, and so on. But at the same time, people thought that living things sort of like magically appeared, or they appeared really from non-living things. And you may say to yourself, well, that makes absolutely no sense. Why would they think that? But you got to remember, we're talking about the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, times when people didn't really have education other than what they learned just by doing. So they had to kind of rely on the people that they thought knew things and what they saw for themselves. And what they saw was that if I left rotting meat out for a long period of time, eventually I would see maggots on it. So make the connection, well, the maggots must come out of the rotting meat. Even though they're two different organisms, two different things, because the meat came from my cow or my sheep or my whatever you happen to be eating, okay? That maggot, which will become a fly, came out of that. Well, we obviously know that that's not the case, but for a long time that was the general consensus, and that's known as spontaneous generation, the idea that things magically appear out of non-living things. So we kind of had to battle that. As we started to head towards the Enlightenment and people started to learn for themselves and to experiment on things and try things, they started to move towards the idea of biogenesis, which is the theory that living things come from other living things. Really not even a theory at this point, it's a scientific fact. But because for such a long period of time people believed in spontaneous generation and that living things come from non-living things, it was really hard to convince somebody that that was not actually the case. I mean, imagine for your entire life believing one thing and then somebody come along and being like, no, you're wrong. You're probably going to fight back on that. And that's exactly what happened. So what we needed were some pretty definitive experiments to kind of disprove this idea of spontaneous generation. And that's exactly what happened. So we're going to discuss three of them. The first one, and we're going to go chronologically here. The first one, what we'll call Reddys Experiment. Okay, and what Reddy did was he took 3 jars of meat. One of them he put and left out uncovered. One of them he sealed completely so that nothing could get in or out. And the third one he put gauze over it. And what his theory was that if spontaneous generation were true, then no matter what, in each scenario, I should see maggots appear on the meat if spontaneous generation were true. So what happened? Well, of course, you and I have already figured out that in the open jar, the maggots appeared, obviously, because the flies were able to land on it and lay their eggs, and maggots appeared. In the sealed jar, of course, nothing appeared inside. And in the jar that had the cloth netting over it, maggots did appear, but not on the meat. It appeared actually on top of the gauze, because the flies would come and land on the gauze when they smelled the meat. So everyone thought, oh, well, this will disprove it. Well, people still didn't believe. They had a hard time believing this, especially because of the sealed container. They thought, oh, well, you have to let whatever magic happen. It has to be able to reach it, so when you seal it, that can't happen. All right, so let's do another experiment. The Paulzani Experiment, obviously done by a guy by the name of Paulzani. And what he did was he took 2 flasks of boiled meat broth, boiled them up because he understood that microorganisms lived inside, and you have to kill those off first. So he boiled them completely, so nothing living inside his meat broth. One he left open, the other he sealed. Again, completely nothing gets in or out. Well, what do you think happened? A couple days later, the open one became cloudy, the sealed one didn't. Same thing as the Reddys Experiment, just with boiled meat. But again, people said you sealed it so the magic couldn't get in. All right, so let's do one more to see if we can actually finally disprove this. And it was done by a guy by the name of Louie Pasteur, and you probably have heard that name before from pasteurization, like with milk. That's the same guy, okay, and they're kind of from the same realm of what he was trying to do, because he was doing experiments, obviously, with microorganisms and how to keep them out of things and to keep our things like milk clean. So what he did, which was different than the other two guys, is he used what was called an open curved neck flask, meaning that it never got sealed. The opening was always there, but as it curved, what that curve allowed to happen was after he boiled the meat broth, the condensation of the water created a little seal there. So technically it was open, which the people that didn't believe wanted to have happen. But yet at the same time, that water, that condensed water, did not allow the microorganisms to pass through all the way into the meat broth. Okay, so he kept that flask of boiled meat on his desk for an entire year. Imagine that. I know for sure I would have broken that thing. But he was able to do it. He left it out. It was there, sealed, or not sealed, sorry, it was open, but it stayed clear for that entire year. Never changed color. 1 year to the day, he broke the neck off the flask, and within a few hours, what do you think happened? Sure enough, it got cloudy. So finally, here's our proof that spontaneous generation could not have happened or could not be true because the microorganisms needed to get in order to reproduce. So living things come from other living things. So biogenesis finally is scientific fact, and we believe it still to this day. Okay. So if you're doing the inquiry learning, go ahead and pause it here, review what we've covered, talked about key terms and phrases. If you're not, just let this go on and we'll ignore these slides as we go. Okay, so let's talk about where life actually began from. Okay, there are three possible origins as to where life could have come from. The first, creation by a supernatural being. Obviously very popular, many people believe this, okay, whether it's intelligent design you believe in or what have you, but the idea that there is a creator. He molded, he created, whatever, how long it took him or her, and that's how we got here. That's perfectly fine. You're allowed to believe that. Not a lot of scientific evidence behind it, but still. Okay, extraterrestrial origins. This is the idea that the planet was seeded by being struck by maybe an asteroid, meteorite, what have you, that happened to have life from another planet. Maybe a planet that exploded or died because of being close to an exploding star, something like that. Okay, had life on it, hurtled through space, was frozen on that thing because of the blackness and coldness of space, landed here in our warm oceans and the prehistoric Earth, and maybe that's how life began. Again, not a ton of scientific evidence, but then again, it makes logical sense. Third is the idea that organic material was formed here on the planet from non-organic material. Well, you may say to yourself, well, that seems least likely of all. How could something organic come from something that's inorganic? Must be magic. Well, actually, we have a lot of evidence that proves that this is probably the way that life began. But again, all three are possible, and I don't want you to discredit any of the three. You need to kind of examine each of them, figure it out for yourself. But we are going to spend some time talking about this third one and how it may have happened. Okay? You got to remember that our early atmosphere, which we talked about in the last section, okay, contained gases, really violent gases like ammonia, methane, hydrogen gas, water vapor. Okay? Now, at the same time where there are these like gigantic thunderstorms just hurtling around the planet, remember the entire planet is just coated in thick clouds, these big thunderstorms. We got an ocean, a warm ocean being heated by the cooling of the earth. Remember how hot it was back then? Again, if you don't remember, go back and review the last unit. So we've got heat, we've got gases, and we've got electricity. We've got chemical reactions taking place from that lightning strike that's happening thousands of times per second all over the planet. Well, if you take all those and then try to recreate it in a lab, okay, we can actually do that. You'll find that you can actually create those organic compounds, and that's exactly what scientists by the name of Miller and Urey did in the miller-urey experiment. Not playing here.
In the 1950s, Stanley Miller, then a graduate student at the University of Chicago, came up with an idea. We could simulate early Earth conditions in the lab and then carefully watch what happens. If you can't study fish in the sea, set up an aquarium. Working with his professor, Harold Urey, Miller designed an apparatus to simulate the ancient water cycle. Together they put in water to model the ancient ocean.
Okay.
It was gently boiled to mimic evaporation.
So there's our heating.
Along with water vapor, for gases of the atmosphere they chose methane, hydrogen, and ammonia. These are simple gases which scientists at the time thought were probably abundant on the ancient Earth. They added a condenser to cool the atmosphere, allowing water molecules to form drops and fall back into their ocean like rain.
Which happens in our own atmosphere.
The ancient Earth would have had many sources of energy, sunlight, geothermal heat, and even thunderstorms, so they added sparks to the atmosphere to simulate lightning.
So there's where your chemical reactions are going to
The goal of the experiment was not to create life, but to simply test the first step in Oparin's model. Can simple chemistry naturally give rise to the complex molecules of life?
Which are made of the same things.
After running the experiment for just 1 week, their ocean became brownish black. Careful analysis revealed that through a series of reactions, many complex molecules had been produced. Among these were amino acids, special molecules of life that we once thought could only be built inside the bodies of living creatures. This was a pivotal breakthrough in science, so significant in fact that it gave rise to an entirely new field of research now known as prebiotic chemistry.
There you go. So the miller-urey experiment proved, okay, that in theory this could have happened, that we could take these inorganic compounds and recombine them to form organic compounds, which could give rise to life, specifically our first amino acids, which we know are the building blocks of protein. Okay. So the first life forms, well, in order to have life, so we've got the organic compounds, but we need a body basically to put them in. And we're talking about cells, remember, being the first life forms on the planet. So what they really need is a membrane, which is what microspheres are. Microspheres are primitive cell structures. They've got a lot of what we need in order to be a cell, but they're not technically alive because they don't pass on genetic material. They're made up of a membrane and some RNA, and they would give rise to the first cells, but they themselves were not the first life forms. So then what was? Well, that was archaebacteria. They appeared about 3.5 billion years ago. We know this because we've actually found some archaebacteria fossils. They are our first living organisms on the planet. They were found near deep sea vents. And if you're not sure what a deep sea vent is, okay, it's like a crack in the crust of the earth where the hot magma lava is exposed and that heat is coming out, but it's underneath the ocean. Okay, so those are your deep sea vents. So what they did was they used the energy from these deep sea vents, this heat, in order to do their chemical reactions that produced energy for them. That's called chemosynthesis. So they did not require oxygen or sunlight necessarily to survive. They just needed that heat. Later on, these would give rise to what's called eubacteria. And they appeared about 2.8 billion years ago. They're descendants, cousins of the archaebacteria. But these are more of our common bacteria that we find today. They've been around for that long. They were the first ones to do something called photosynthesis, where you could take sunlight and convert it into energy using carbon dioxide, which was abundant in the oceans at that time, and that's sunlight and then water. Okay. All right. So about 2.4 billion years ago, because all these cyanobacteria now are producing oxygen, what happened was, at the time, oxygen was actually poisonous, and there was so much of it in the atmosphere that about 96% of all the life on the planet, again, mostly in the oceans, went extinct because of the oxygen. Kind of crazy to think about, right? But what happened was the ones that did survive and the ones that stayed would give rise to oxygen-wielding or oxygen-using organisms like you and I, okay? And this was the first of the major extinction events. There's been 5 in Earth's history. I'm sure you could probably think of a few off the top of your head. So we had archaebacteria or ancient bacteria, eubacteria, modern bacteria, and now we have eukaryotes like you and I. They appeared about 1.5 billion years ago, and they appeared when those prokaryotes, remember we were talking about this in the cells unit, when they actually formed a relationship, an endosymbiotic relationship, where one lived inside the other one. The little guy, little blue here, he will become our mitochondria. He's going to give the red guy energy. So this symbiotic relationship, which is still occurring today inside each one of our cells, is how we determine when the first eukaryotes appear. It's actually 2 prokaryotes living together in this union. Okay? Around this time, and I say around, I know it's 400 million years later, but in Earth's history, that's really not that long. But around this time, we had our first supercontinent appear, which is called Rodinia. Yeah, I know you want to say Pangea, but Pangea won't show up for another 500, 600 million years. Okay? But this was our first large continent. It broke up around 750 million years ago. When that happened, it changed the patterns of the water and the warm water currents. And since we had a change, it actually threw off the whole cycle of how warm air and water got passed around. And what happened was we went into our first ice age and what we call the first snowball Earth. Sorry. Okay, so this is kind of a review of what we've covered so far. Okay. You can see the different things that are, going back to the last one. So in conclusion, biogenesis, life from life, disproved spontaneous generation. We had 3 theories as to the origin of life. And then we learned that microspheres will give rise to archaebacteria, which gives